Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Research Fellow for China and National Security at the Heritage Foundation. A reminder to our audience for whom we are most grateful. Viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com. You can also access all of our episodes at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Susan Crabtree, RealClearPolitics national political correspondent. She previously served as a senior writer for the Washington Free Beacon and spent 5 years as a White House correspondent for the Washington Examiner. She is a 2024 Dow Prize for Investigative Journalism recipient. She is a contributing author to Fool's Gold, the radicals, con artists, and traitors who killed the California dream and now threaten us all, a topic that we will get into in today's conversation. But with that, Susan, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Thanks so much for having me, Steve. It's great to be with you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have today's conversation. As I warned or teased, however nice it was, we want to talk a little bit about how your upbringing led to what you've ended up doing as a career. I only know you as a journalist and now distinguished author, but there's probably some other things that were on your mind, say in elementary school when a teacher popped the question, said, what do you want to do when you grow up? Did you say, I want to be a journalist, or I'm going to cover politics? Or were you like the rest of us and just had no idea?
Well, my mom actually was really instrumental in fostering writing and reading when I was very young. She taught me to read when I was 3 or 4 years old, and she's a teacher. My dad was an Air Force pilot. He flew C-130s in Vietnam, and he was a career Air Force the whole 20 years or more. So we were lucky, though, that we spent most of our time in Northern California, Travis Air Force Base, and then Hawaii, and then Southern California when I was in my elementary and junior high school. Prior to that, my dad and my mom and my sister lived in Taiwan. And so when he was in Vietnam, he would come back once a month and get to visit them on deployment. It's not what I consider a real deployment, but it was, concerning because he was shot at in Vietnam. So I grew up with that sort of anti-communism mentality in my household, and a lot of love for journalism, reading. The newspaper was always a conversation piece in our household, and we watched a lot of in-depth journalism, like 60 Minutes, investigative journalism. So my mom said she's sort of living vicariously through me because she had always wanted to be a journalist, but she was sort of itinerant with my dad's career and needed to be a teacher. So that's sort of how my background.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time in California in my junior high and high school years, and I absolutely loved it. It was sort of this idyllic experience. We lived by an Air Force base that's no longer there, inland. It's called the Inland Empire. It was Norton Air Force Base in Redlands, California. But we constantly would go out to San Diego and, of course, the beach towns and surf and have a good time. And as long as we kept our grades up, that was okay with our parents. So I grew up loving California and sort of this outdoor life, but then went to DC, spent 23 years there.
Well, it sounds like you had some pretty deep-rooted love of America. My wife's father was a fighter pilot in Air Force for multiple decades and spent some time out there in California too. So she might be a little bit either happy or jealous about talking about California in the good old days because as we'll get into later in the conversation, today's California experience isn't what you were describing of that upbringing, but I'll let you tell that part of the story. But as you were going through that, and you had great exposure to reading and attracted to doing the written word. Did you study journalism in college? And so you're one of the rare guests we've had who kind of grew up and went through an educational arc where you actually did what you studied.
Yes, I was in the high school newspaper staff. I kind of knew early on that I loved news and I loved history. So I pursued that in journalism. I went to Northwestern. I transferred away from Northwestern to go to USC, Southern California, graduated from there, and immediately went to Washington, D.C. And in Washington, as you know, for young people, is such amazing opportunities. So I got a job at the Washington Times. I had an internship at National Geographic, actually. And then that got me a job at the Washington Times Magazine in the mid 90s. So then
Yeah.
I covered Congress and I wrote all kinds of wonderful feature stories and news stories. And they really just immersed you right into politics from the get go. You were learning on the job and it was wonderful. It was sort of trial by fire, but you went up to Capitol Hill and it was this amazing world that you had access to lawmakers and got to really ask them questions and hold their feet to the fire.
Well, that's another thing that's sort of changed. I mean, my coming of age on policy was in the '90s, and I was at Heritage, and it was a short walk to go from Heritage up to the Senate office buildings. But back then, you could just walk into the buildings for the most part. You could
Right.
walk around in the buildings, and you would run into members and staffers and stuff like that. I mean, number one, 9/11 changed a bit of the accessibility. But then COVID made a lot of people remote, even on the Hill to this day. I don't know that they're back to full force, but boy, that's a really different environment. But just thinking back to the Washington Times of the '90s and the politics of the Hill in the '90s, those were some really go-go times of policy, entrepreneurship, and activism and stuff like that. It was a great time to be in that thought enterprise. But I can also think back to, so you've got California experience, journalism experience, that time on the Hill. You also had family that had lived over in Asia and had a bit of experience looking across that body of water between California and the continent that I think is either going to save or challenge our republic in a profound way. But talk a little bit about how you were seeing kind of the foreign policy set of issues change from when you were starting out in the mid 90s, say at the Washington Times Magazine, to what you've done up to most recently covering national politics.
So back in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a big push for permanent normal trade relations with China. China had just entered the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And I was covering what was back then known as the Blue Dogs and the moderates,
Yep.
Blue Dog Democrats, which are, extinct. I think they're extinct by now, but they were more centrist Democrats who believed in free trade. And there was also a lot of Republicans at the time who thought opening China it was just a matter of an openness, sort of a glasnost, the same approach that we took with Russia, that they would actually bring about greater democracy to the people of China. And that was the big argument. Of course, there were detractors back then, including Nancy Pelosi, as we see people going back to those clips of her pushing against China because she was very deeply concerned about human rights. And she opposed any kind of normalizing of trade relations with China, while people like Rob Portman, who was the USTR trade representative for the Bush administration, were pushing hard in favor of permanent normal trade relations. I was covering Representative Portman at the time very closely, the Republican leadership in the House. That was my focus at the time. And I remember sort of this debate that was going on. Is it just a matter of sort of a glass-nose? Is it just a matter of getting cell phones into China and getting our cars into China and the shared economy that would bring about fundamental human rights improvements in their nation? Or is that a bogus argument? Well, obviously fast forward to the last 10 years, and we know that China, that argument didn't really play out as a lot of Republicans and people pro-trade people thought it would or hoped it would. And it was sort of a naive thought process on our part. And we have President Xi now in charge, and he has been one of the worst and when it comes to human rights and persecuting religious minorities such as the Uyghurs and the Falun Gong and even Christians. I've written a lot about, one of my passions also is religious freedom. And so I've written a lot about the fate of the Uyghurs, the surveillance state, what they've gone through, also with the Falun Gong and Christians that have left. And there was a Mayflower church that I was one of the first people to write about, this church of this group of Christians that had to flee China and were sort of hanging in the balance. So going to, I think it was an island off of South Korea, and then Thailand, and we're so fearing from the CCP. So I wrote a series of those stories. I think it was last year or the year before. They finally were allowed into Texas during the Biden administration. There was a big push because there was fear they were going to be going back to China. So yeah, the human rights are at a all-time high. A nadir. Sorry, I misspoke. But they're they're facing terrible situation, and so when we had that APEC summit in San Francisco, and where all of these tech leaders, big tech leaders, including Elon Musk, were basically feting him and paying a lot of money to go to a dinner where President Xi was basically San Francisco, and the leaders there and Gavin Newsom rolled out the red carpet for President Xi at that summit. It was really startling to me. And I was deeply concerned when I was hearing reports from human rights activists on the ground, people from Hong Kong, American citizens now, but also Uyghurs and others getting really human rights violations, experiencing sort of these Chinese, I don't know where they were coming from, could have been from the embassies, from what I understand, that we know now from some of the work from Mike Gallagher and others in Congress, that they were experiencing horrific persecution in the streets of San Francisco. And I was one of the first to report on that experience, those experiences too. So it was eye-opening for me. And that was one of the reasons we started to do the investigation into the book, as well as just things I was experiencing, the cost of living, the terrible homeless scourge, and the problems during COVID, including, crime sprees. So those are the origins for the book. So I teamed up with Peter Schweitzer's group, who specializes in investigating political ties to American politicians, ties to the CCP. And that's how we got together on the book idea for Fool's Gold.
Yeah, well, it's kind of perfect bookends for the arc of what U.S.-China relations were. The Pelosi versus the establishment mainstream view of the 1990s. Audience knows, full confession, I was a part of that mainstream in the 1990s, writing about trying to have the missionary influence in China, trying to open up opportunity, and the early days of the power of markets, power of information. Who can block the internet? Well, challenge was accepted, and it turns out the CCP had ideas about how they might be able to control and block the internet. But we did engage in that bet. But that California experience, you really have the bookends of Pelosi and Feinstein in that period, both out of San Francisco. And then you have what I think is kind of the low watermark in San Francisco, again, like you were describing, with that visit, and that's Gavin Newsom. And Gavin Newsom has a history in San Francisco. And there's going to be a little bit of history in the dealings with China, Chinese entities, and things like that too. But I really think that visit to San Francisco was the low watermark, where a lot of Americans were there, as you accurately described, kissing the emperor's ring to a degree. And my goodness, to have an American city completely locked down and red flags waving along with that red carpet, and protesters who seemingly can run rampant in every American city as long as they're protesting an approved cause. They somehow were swept away, Chinese style, in San Francisco. That was breathtaking. And I guess the only silver lining in that is in the few years since, I really feel like America's in a different place now. And I'm hoping that my wish is not the father of my thought in that, but that's part of our later conversation. But since you brought us up to the building blocks of what got you into Fool's Gold, let's talk a little bit about basically the core message of the book, and then we'll dial into a little bit of, I think it was chapter 3, that looks at some of these issue areas where influence operations can at least be questioned. Some of it looks like pretty black and white, not just questionable kinds of dealings. But talk a bit about Fool's Gold, the work you put into bringing it into life, how long it took, but the core message of this discourse about California and how it relates to the rest of the country.
Yeah, so we came together with Fool's Gold. I was writing a proposal for a book during COVID because I was sort of startled and taken aback by what was happening in California. We'll go through a few of those, and then we can get into the heart of the China material. But during COVID, we as Californians were locked down, had more restrictions on us than many across the country, and there was all kinds of failures with the basic provisions that government is supposed to provide, including the unemployment process. So people were locked down, forced out of work to a greater degree, while churches were locked down, while liquor stores stayed open. There was carve-outs for Hollywood that were given by Gavin Newsom, because he's friends with Hollywood lobbyists, and yet our unemployment system was a complete mess. There was $30 billion of fraud in the system, but certain people that I knew couldn't get the unemployment they deserved, so they were just going into their savings. It was startling to me to see the homelessness just out of hand. When I first got to California, there was a hepatitis breakout in San Diego where 17 people were killed because of the homeless on the streets. They weren't cleaning up the streets. And then crime spiked, and there was all these smash and grabs during COVID. And meanwhile, Gavin Newsom was letting out, we call it a jailbreak, but he let out 70,000, up to 70,000. We believe it's 70,000. They won't give us the straight numbers. Hardened criminals out of the prison systems onto the streets. And he then kind of wondered why there was a huge spike in crime and violent crime in California and these smash and grabs. So all of that was taking place. I already had an interest and was reporting on the persecution of religious freedom in China. So that was also an area we thought was interesting. We found when we were looking into Gavin Newsom after that APEC summit, we were involved in the book right then, working with Peter Streicher's group. My co-author is Jed McFadder, who has done some of the top research for many of Peter Streicher's top best-selling books on Chinese influence and on American politicians. So we found that there was this interesting structure on one of Gavin Newsom's vineyards, and it was the heart of where they do the mixology for the chemistry for the vineyard and to make wine. And it was made out of Chinese shipping. The whole office was made out of a Chinese shipping crate. And I thought, well, that's odd. And so off they went, Peter Schweizer's, Jed McFadder, and trading information with me about what I knew about what happened during COVID. For instance, during COVID, Gavin Newsom had a deal for PPE with China that was for nearly $1 billion. And he wasn't disclosing all the details of that. It was from this Chinese-based group called Build Your Dreams. They're actually an electric vehicle manufacturer, but they were switched to providing PPE. So we were dealing this big deal with China on that, but they didn't meet their deadlines. The PPE was not up to the masks were not up to great quality. When we finally did get them, it was a big mess. There was lots of headlines about it, and we also noticed by looking at the behested payment, which is a system which I believe is pay to play in California, where you can ask the governor and other politicians can ask corporations to donate to their favorite cause, to politicians' favorite cause, even if they had business before the governor's office, and then they can provide that money. It's what I think is, it's a terrible money in politics issue in California. Gavin Newsom ends up asking, in this behested payment scheme, asked TikTok to donate to the public service announcements to keep people locked down in COVID. So it was just strange to me that the Chinese company, that China had this virus had occurred in China. We didn't know that it was at the Wuhan lab yet. We had suspicions back then and some reporting, but it, it originated in China, this virus, and yet Gavin Newsom was choosing a Chinese company, TikTok, that was controversial in and of itself, for surveilling everybody, including Americans, and using that to support a public service announcement to keep us all locked down and abide by Gavin Newsom's rules. That really, didn't set well with me.
Yeah,
So,
if I read it right, it's something in the neighborhood of like $300,000
yes.
was contributed. It was probably a meaningful amount of money for some PSAs to go out there, and of course, propagating the Chinese recommended response to the China virus.
Yeah, basically shutting down our economy and keeping us, all these mandates on us so that we're limiting our freedom. And, at the same time, you had him with the French laundry scandal come up. And so, he was facing a recall and people were very, very angry. So we thought we would take a hard look at, sort of his ties to China because, you know, as all this was playing out, then the APEC summit occurred. And then subsequently, he had this big trip to China where he, met with President Xi, shook his hand, had a photographer that was paid for by by the California taxpayers, $100,000 salary to go follow Gavin Newsom all around China and take pictures of him with Xi, take pictures of him at this Build What Your Dreams EV factory, and where he was driving Chinese electric vehicles instead of supporting the California and American markets like Tesla. So it was just something that was really we decided we thought we'd really do a deep dive on. And what we found is that Gavin Newsom, when he was mayor and when he was transitioning to lieutenant governor, he started what he called a nonprofit. It was called China SF.
Yeah, I
And
wanted to get in on that. I think this really does kind of capture the arc of influence operations that you can see in a number of different jurisdictions, but this is a perfect summary of an approach to the gateway city of California.
yes, we believe that he really flung open the golden gates of California to Chinese companies, and he liked to say it was to help the California economy, but actually, he brought in there was a lot of mobsters, criminals, and obviously intellectual property thieves that he let in, and also people that bought up a lot of agricultural land in California. So we looked into this, and there were several instances that caught our eye. Um, we know that Chinese, back when we were doing the research on Gavin Newsom's rise in San Francisco politics, of course, he owes his rise to Willie Brown. We all know the Willie Brown's connections to Kamala Harris as well, but Willie Brown gave uh, Gavin Newsom his first job, but also it was the Chinese voters in San Francisco that he really owed his allegiance to because they helped him. They thought he was going to be more pro business than the Green Party candidate. He had internal polls showing that he was pretty close. The race was closer than he wanted it to be. And so the Chinese voters in San Francisco really helped him win that race for San Francisco mayor. And he celebrated with them afterwards and went into Chinatown. And then, so we thought that was interesting too, but it was really this creation of China SF that took a look at it. It brought in with tax incentives that Gavin Newsom promised and orchestrated more than 100 Chinese companies into California. But the reverse really didn't occur. That California businesses weren't getting entry into China except for his own wine business. Gavin Newsom trademarked 2 of his wines and ended up having a very shishi wine tasting with high-level CCP executives in Shanghai, where he was personally pouring his own wine for these CCP executives and a business tycoon named Vincent Lowe that he was doing business with, and making sure that all these Chinese business was flowing into California.
Well, it's one of the great ironies. A lot of America and a lot of the world, when they think of the Bay Area, and they think of tech and some household names, and you ended up with sort of household names from China making their way in, like Huawei, communications company, but the big tech companies of the United States based in the Bay Area weren't making any headway getting into China. And I don't recall that really sending tremors through California politics about why isn't this working for us?
No, in fact, as you remember, Solyndra was a big, joke line during the Obama administration for conservatives. It was the solar company that the Obama administration, and Biden was involved in this too, as vice president, provided $500 million of U.S. taxpayer subsidies to. Okay. So what happened, though, was it went bust, and we all thought that was a big joke. Our conservatives like to poke fun at it back in the day. Well, at the time, Newsom had lured in SunTech, and he personally recruited the executive of SunTech, which is a Chinese solar company, and they came in and they dumped their products onto the market. Obviously, they were the Chinese government was subsidizing them as well, and they dumped their products, and it undercut Solyndra, and that's one of the reasons that contributed to Solyndra's demise. Solyndra ended up suing SunTech and winning in the courts. Not that they would ever see anything really justification for that. But what happened to SunTech, the Chinese company, is that it had some bogus loans overseas. And we actually put SunTech on the U.S. Stock Exchange. So it was U.S. taxpayers that were actually invested in it. And SunTech, even after they helped ruin Solyndra, they went bust themselves because they had all this bogus loans. So it was really the U.S. taxpayers, citizens who invested in it that ended up holding the bag on that investment. And it was just one of the several examples that we have of sort of criminal behavior on the part of these companies that came in that Gavin Newsom lured in. And at some point, he even promised that he would, get through the permitting process, expedite the permitting process. And if you know anything about California, that's one of the big things, especially when it comes to real estate and building anything. You're so laid down with red tape in California that the businesses are leaving. But Gavin Newsom promised to expedite the permitting process for some of these companies that he brought in from China.
Well, you also mentioned ag land, I believe, and that was one of those that was a head scratcher for me, because I remember at the time this was getting through California's legislative process. I was working with friends in several other states that were trying to limit CCP ties to ag land or land near military bases. Mm-hmm. And people tended to see this, I think, inaccurately, but tended to see it as a partisan issue. But then all of a sudden I saw in California where it can't be a partisan issue because it's essentially a one-party state. It was supermajority going through the legislature there, where California Democrats had consensus that they wanted to keep foreign ownership of ag land at bay, and then Chinese, or CCP, I should say, influence there was a key target. And it passed the legislature, but was vetoed by the governor. So talk to us a little bit about how did this kind of bolt from the blue in California play out? Because I only kind of got the Cliff Notes version, but I sort of was like, what's going on here?
Yeah, it didn't get that much attention, and we noticed it right away because we were looking into it. It was in September 2022, and basically it was passed supermajority, just like you described, and with great support, one party control of the legislatures in California. They had Democrats have a supermajority. They passed it unanimously in both the Assembly and the Senate. And then Gavin Newsom, he vetoed it, and he said, "Oh, it's actually duplicative of what the USDA, the Agricultural Department's already doing." And we're just thinking, no, why didn't you say
Tell
that?
us, please.
Yeah, and then we realized, of course, we looked into that, and that their reporting is not accurate on all of the land that Chinese and other foreign nationals own. They don't really do a fabulous job. I know I find that shocking at the federal government keeping track of all of these purchases, but it was just so strange to us, and we were wondering. We looked into it, and Gavin Newsom has lots of vineyards, of quite a few in Napa Valley, and near his vineyards are other Chinese-owned vineyards. Now, we don't know if that played a role. We don't know if it played a role about his access to Chinese markets for his own wine, but that's what we were looking into. We found all of these different Chinese-owned vineyards very close to his own vineyards. He also was instrumental in getting a real estate tycoon known as Z&L Properties. It's sort of a subsidiary of a huge Chinese real estate conglomerate, and it had bought up a bunch of land. And this is one of the people that Gavin Newsom was working with China SF. And the landowner, Zhang Li, was later convicted of fraud and bribery. So not only would the bill have prevented this type of land grab, but Newsom sort of facilitated Z&L's entry into California via China SF, and then actually received what we found were $26,000 in donations from them in his gubernatorial campaign in 2017. And that's just one of them. China Ocean Wide Holdings is another CCP-connected Chinese conglomerate. It bought up a 180-acre ranch in Sonoma County, where it was establishing a resort and winery. China Oceanwide was initially recruited through the China SF program.
Mm-hmm. Well, just remind the audience, we're still just talking about one of the states of the United States. We've, in other episodes, covered influence operations that are in New York or other major cities. But we're having the veritable potpourri with just California right now. There's one other thing that really popped out to me in the book chapter, and it was the hiring of a former CCP official to be the chief investment officer for California's pension system. And so it was kind of interesting that you'd have a former CCP official hired to any statewide position of any import. And why would that ever be necessary? Surely there are other candidates. We had a whopping salary for that too. It was like $1.5 million. So help us unpack a little bit about what was the deal with the guy? How did this come into being? And did that have any ripple effects in the California political system to say, wait a minute, what's going on here?
Well, strangely enough, it got more attention in Washington than it got in California. You had Representative Jim Banks, then Representative Jim Banks. It was investigating why in the world would we be hiring a top CCP banking official to oversee CalPERS, which is the government retirement system for California. And then, of course, this individual started investing in Chinese military companies, and it was outrageous. He was highest paid person in California government. And so when all the scrutiny started happening, there was a complaint against him that he wasn't fired because of of those concerns. He was fired because he had a conflict of interest in a Blackstone investment that he then invested in. So he had his own disclosure. I don't think he disclosed the Blackstone investment, and then he purchased a lot of Blackstone. But that was, we asked, so the California Political Practices Commission, which is notorious for slow walking its investigations and really slapping people on the wrist, we asked them, what's going on with this investigation, because they launched an investigation into his conflict of interest. It took them 4 years, and we kept badgering them last year. Are you done with your investigation? Are you done? What did you find? Finally found that he was guilty of that conflict of interest, and they fined him $10,000, which is like incredible slap on the wrist for somebody making 1.5 million. It's just unbelievable.
Well, I thought it was a scandal when Anthony Fauci's salary was revealed. That was for a federal position, at least. This is truly, truly remarkable in scope, in magnitude. But so we've covered a bit about California, the China angle on it, but I want to take advantage of you being someone who's covered national politics and help extrapolate sort of the theme that your book jacket will talk about. What happens in California isn't staying in California. Some of your findings there, yes, they hone in on the current governor, who may or may not seek political influence in the future. But this clearly is a narrative that we're finding in other parts of the country. What do you see as kind of the key takeaways from the book, where you want it to be an early warning for other parts of the United States, and if there are particular parts of the United States you'd want to flag?
Well, California, with Gavin Newsom now obviously eyeing with he's like, is she running for president via podcast these days? But he's really obviously wanted to be the one that was chosen, not Kamala Harris last year, for the Democratic nomination. He kind of threw some pot shots her way at the Democratic convention, saying, I'm supposed to talk about this being a democratic process, that she was basically coronated as the nominee. So he was, he's always been, they've had this frenemy relationship, he and Kamala Harris, that we write about in the book, from back in their days of San Francisco politics. But Gavin Newsom, I think one of the concerns is on the 80-20 issue that he talked about in this podcast with Charlie Kirk. He said that he agrees that men and women's sports, or if you want to say trans athletes, competing in women's and girls' sports is deeply unfair. Okay. Well, that was really kind of shocking to me, because he and his wife have been deeply involved in trans athletes and promoting accepting trans ideology for the last 10 to 15 years. There is a law that's on the books in California that allows trans athletes to participate in women's and men's sports, and they believe in that law and they support that law. In fact, his wife has this Gender Justice Films that she uses behest payments. It's interesting. He uses behest payments to help her pay for them, and then there are films that contain things like the Genderbread Person, where it's like the Miss Potato Head, where you mix and match ideologies. And then she takes those films that she makes, and Gavin Newsom actually has some cameos in these films, and then she sells them to public schools across the country. And she makes a profit on screening them, and has so far screened about 5,000 public schools, these films. And that's a way that they're exporting their own values and beliefs to the rest of the country. And it's obviously an 80-20 issue and played a big role in the last election. But he says now it's deeply unfair, but he's not changing his policies. There's also all kinds of electric vehicle mandates and clean air policies that are happening in California that are picked up all across the country. Also, as you know, under Kamala Harris's, when she was Attorney General, she played a role in making sure that immigrants and prisoners could get trans surgeries and be paid for by by the taxpayers of California. That was something that now other states have picked up on. When it comes to right now, what's playing out right now, we have the Attorney General working with Gavin Newsom. His name is Rob Bonta. He is would like to launch big lawsuits against the oil and gas industry for their role in what they argue is climate change. And he's trying to get other states on board with these big lawsuits that are modeled after the tobacco lawsuits of the 1990s. Meanwhile, California is running deep deficits. So to me, it seems like they're trying to find a way to fill their coffers. So we go through a lot of there at the final chapter has all of the different ideas and policies that they're trying to export to other places.
Well, hopefully they won't bring the let's go to China to find solutions option to pedal across to other states in the union, because California has a long history of engagement across the Pacific. There's a distinguished history of Chinese migration into what became the United States of America. And that's well before the People's Republic of China was even an idea. And I wish that Gavin Newsom might have known a little bit more of that history, that the multiple generations, even in Chinatown and San Francisco, are not necessarily People's Republic of China Chinese families, multiple generation Americans, but from eras that predate the communist experience. But you'd thought that in such a formerly fascinating, thriving city like San Francisco, there would have been a lot of good to learn. But he seemed to edit along the way. But before we wind into final thoughts, talk a little bit about how you've seen, how you're seeing the current frame of U.S. and China. You've got a unique window into this. I've been told over the years when I was in politics or policy that foreign policy doesn't drive things, but it sure does seem like there's some international stuff that is weighing pretty heavily in the national narrative right now. And China's right there. But since I watch China stuff closely, maybe I'm not the right judge. How do you see where this is in 2025 as we look towards midterms and who knows what after that?
Well, it's interesting to me that now people are giving Donald Trump a very hard time over these tariffs in the media and on Capitol Hill as well, even with Republicans' deep concerns, especially in the Senate, that that Joe Biden actually continued some of the tariffs that President Trump had in place on China. And there was this huge trade deficit that nobody was willing to take on. And it's really interesting to see the sort of how President Xi is going to react. He's been acting with impunity as far as it comes when it comes to human rights in his own country, and sort of lodging this disinformation campaign about what the Uyghur persecution. He denies that it's even existing, and you have Nike and a lot of different companies, Calvin Klein, a lot of companies that we consider everyday American companies that we're proud of, but they're getting a lot of their labor made cheaply in China at the expense of persecuted minorities like the Uyghurs who are forced into labor camps. So it's interesting to me to see that exposed, because even with Temu, people they're advertising at our biggest sporting events, and people don't realize that there's a cost there. So I think that Donald Trump is taking this on. I don't know how Xi will react. He's sort of boxed into a corner right now. He keeps upping the ante. It's kind of a tenuous time, but also an exciting time to see that finally the president of the United States is confronting the situation that's been ongoing for years and years and years. And I also think that it's interesting what will happen with this TikTok deal, and whether we're going to, it would seem like that Jeff Bezos, which actually a lot of his products on Amazon are made from Chinese forced labor, which is a deep concern. Well, Bezos going to suddenly come forward and solve the TikTok problem and make a deal with the Chinese government that to allow it to stay. But then we heard last week that deal is off for now, at least, with these tensions rising so high between the U.S. and China. Personally, I think the confronting China is good for the people in China, good for human rights worldwide, and also good for the United States' bottom line and rebuilding our own manufacturing in this country.
Well, we're definitely going to be in for interesting times, as they say, and there's going to be some turbulence. I tend to agree with you that this is necessary trouble, as people sometimes want to say in politics. And also, we're not the only part of this equation. Xi Jinping and the Communist Party are driving some of these events, and we're reacting in some ways. So we've got a pretty intense headbutt going on right now, and we'll see where it all goes. But as we wind down, Susan, this is a chance where I want people to take a crack at the book, tell them where they can go find it, and where should they look to follow your written word and commentary.
You can go to on x.com. I'm just Susan Crabtree at Susan Crabtree. And then I'm at RealClearPolitics, www.realclearpolitics.com. If you click on writers, you can find my name and you can see all of the work, all of the stories I've written over the last 5-6 years. And that's the best places you can reach me. And also, if you want to buy Fool's Gold, it's available on Amazon. But there's other options. We are in Barnes & Noble and all booksellers, usually online booksellers that sell where you can find the books that you like the most. It's foolsgoldbook.org is the URL, and you can find a lot more information about the book and the different buying options.
Well, I definitely encourage the audience to check out Fool's Gold and to also follow Susan's writing and commentary. For our audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends, consider subscribing, and visit ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you very much for joining, and a special thank you to Susan Crabtree for sharing her perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.